History is about critically analysing your sources and understanding why they were written that way and understanding what biases they might have and understanding all of these things and making connections and postulating links. And I think this is something that often gets lost.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm your host, Alexander Eth, and today we are elated to talk about magic, science, and religion in the Middle Ages with Dr. Joanne Edge. So many people today, including some famous scientists and authors, use terms like the Dark Ages and the medieval period incorrectly. And Dr. Edge is the perfect guest to take us back in time to discuss the meaning of magic, science, and religion in the Middle Ages, and the multiple meanings. Dr. Edge specializes in late medieval and early modern European social and cultural history, with an emphasis on medicine and the occult sciences, divination, magic, and astrology. Dr. Edge did her undergraduate and postgraduate degrees at the University of London and held a 4-year postdoctoral position as assistant editor on the Casebooks project at the University of Cambridge. She is currently Latin manuscripts cataloger at the John Rylands Library, University of Manchester. Dr. Edge wrote an excellent article published on Forbidden Histories entitled A Categorical Mistake: Science, Magic, and Religion in the Middle Ages. In this episode, Dr. Edge explains how the words magic, science, and religion meant different things in the Middle Ages versus the way that many people casually throw the terms around today without putting them in their proper historical context. We discuss this topic, medicine and science in the Middle Ages, and so much more. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, I give you Dr. Joanne Edge. Dr. Joanne Edge, thank you so much for stopping by the Glitch Bottle podcast today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Can you share with the listeners, Joe, a little bit about your background and kind of your own history? Like, how did you first become interested in late medieval and early modern European history?
So I don't have a traditional background in that I didn't start my undergraduate degree until I was 24. And I was living in Oxford and I was working in local government, and I thought, I've got to get a degree. I was so bored, and I was so it was like a monotonous kind of existence. And so I went back to the Oxford University Department for Continuing Education, which is part of Oxford University, and I did a 2-year foundation certificate in what's called modern history. And that was equivalent to the first year of an undergraduate degree. And at that point, I then moved to the University of London to finish my BA at Goldsmiths College. And in my second year, I had a very interesting experience on several modules that I took, one of which was the apocalypse in the Middle Ages. And I learned quite a lot about the different ways in which people conceived of the Black Death, the different explanations that were given for the Black Death, and how you might have explanations that seemed religious or seemed scientific, but in fact shared many things in common. And it really got me thinking about categories in that way. And at that time, I also did modules in medical history and in magic and myth, and so witchcraft and that kind of thing. And then I got my degree and I moved to the UCL, University College London, to do my master's in medieval studies. And I had a tutor called Dr. Sophie Page, who may be known to you and your listeners. And immediately I thought, I want to do something about medicine, but I want to do something about futures and prediction. And Sophie sort of said, oh, well, there's something that I've seen in manuscripts. And at that point, I went to have a look at this sphere of Pythagoras, as it's called, which is a numerological device. You take someone's name and you convert the letters into numbers and you make calculations, and it will tell you if someone's going to live or die. It's very popular throughout the Middle Ages. And so I ended up doing my MA thesis on that alongside modules on magic and other things. And then I ended up doing a PhD at Royal Holloway in the same topic, the sphere of Pythagoras. And so it was really several things that kind of came together to sort of get me interested in. And I've always been very keen on things that don't quite fit into neat categories. They give us a lot of information. I think they are the kind of flashpoints. So, for example, I did an essay during my master's on the mule in medieval encyclopedias and bestiaries. And a mule is a hybrid animal that doesn't really fit into the neat categories that have been kind of imposed on nature. by medieval thinkers, and so it causes a great deal of anxiety. And I suppose I kind of have been getting increasingly frustrated recently with this idea that somehow categories that we have today somehow have always meant what they mean today, and that people expect to be able to project them on the past and see what they want, and they want this kind of neat progress. And that's just not how things are. And in fact, these are not interesting questions to be asking so much as thinking about the context of the time.
Can you kind of elaborate on that, Joe? Because so many people throw around words today like science, magic, religion, the Dark Ages, even the word, as you touch on so succinctly in your article, medieval itself. The word medieval has a specific context and a specific usage at the time, that it just, using medieval versus the Middle Ages. Was the use of all these terms, Joe, and the lack of context, was it an intentional thing that people do, or was it just kind of a natural thing over time where people are like, the Middle Ages, or, the Dark Ages? Like, is it a conscious effort to tweak history, or is it more of just like something that just unfortunately happens?
I think what we have is the Dark Ages and medieval have become a sort of bogeyman and a kind of offset to, our current times, which are enlightened, which isn't true, of course, but what we have is this kind of contrast between what is known as the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages or medieval and our current times of great enlightenment. And of course, there are big problems with this because firstly, this is quite political in that the idea that a lot of scary political things that are happening at the moment are somehow dark and medieval and they belong in the past. It kind of makes out that these things are all things that only happen in the past and don't happen now, and it's almost projecting. And I think that's really scary because, we're still, as brutal things happen today, brutal things are still happening today. And to make out that these things are only things that can happen in the past or only things that should happen in the past is really damaging, and not only to the past, but possibly more importantly to the present. So there's that. And I think the Dark Ages, certainly when you come to people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, I don't think he really cares whether he's being accurate or not about medieval thought and the complexities of medieval intellectual history. I think what he is trying to do is to sort of say, this is a kind of counter bogeyman to my wonderful world of progress and enlightenment, and everything just kind of gets better and better. And isn't science brilliant and the rest of it? And I don't think that's particularly fair, and I don't think it's particularly interesting. And I think the problem is exactly when you consign things like complex topics like religion and magic into one big barrel labelled superstition or labelled irrational thought, you fail to kind of really get to grips with what we're dealing with, not only in the past, but in the present. And I think that's what has been constantly leading to more and more pent-up frustration, has been this idea that we can apply these categories to the past and that we should expect to see these making sense in the past.
Can you take us back, Joe, and just kind of set the stage for us in the Middle Ages? Can you give us just a brief overview in terms of what did the terms science, magic, and religion mean, and how were they overall used? Like in the article you point out someone who was religious, has a different meaning versus someone who was non-religious, and then the way it was used today. Can you just kind of set the stage for us?
Of course, as I've said several times, there isn't one mode of thought in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is really a period of over 1,000 years, spanning different areas, different geographical areas, different religions, The surviving evidence that we have is overwhelmingly literary evidence. So that's only the evidence of people who were writing, people who were able to write. And so the evidence that we have is very biased towards a certain kind of person, I suppose. But basically, in the Middle Ages, in the medieval West, the term scientia in Latin, from which science derives, just meant knowledge. If you went back looking for the word scientia to try and trace some history of modern science, you wouldn't get very far at all. What we call science might be deemed natural philosophy in the Middle Ages. Given that the entire framework of thought that people are writing in is one of religion, and scholastics trying to consolidate ancient learning, so this philosophy of Aristotle, of Plato, of ancient philosophers with Christian theology, you can't really talk about natural philosophy or science as separate from theology. And so that's the first problem. The second problem is that to be religious in the Middle Ages meant that you had undertaken monastic orders and that you were a member of a religious community in that sense. A bishop was going to be a secular, and that just means not a monk. And so religious in the Middle Ages just means of a particular kind of religious belief. And so basically, you can only really talk about not being religious when you have a concept of not being religious, i.e. atheism. And this is a much, much later thing, certainly not something that you would see much of in the Middle Ages. And so that's the second problem, is that the idea of not being religious, you might believe in a false religion, or might be deemed to believe in a false religion, or a wrong religion, or a perverted religion, but I don't really think there's much sense of what we would call atheism in the Middle Ages. Neil deGrasse Tyson, of course, would tell you that all of those people's books were burned so you'd never know. But I think that's far too a convenient explanation. And then, of course, we have magic, which I could spend all day here trying to come up with a completely satisfactory definition of medieval magic. And the problems that we encounter are that a lot of medieval magical texts will contain prayers and invocations to the Christian God, angels and things. And so a lot of the time you're thinking, well, how is this any different really to Orthodox Christian practice? But the problem is that someone in authority has deemed that this is somehow heretical. And you don't have a consensus of opinion necessarily between every single authority as to what is allowed and what isn't allowed. Certainly in the earlier part of the Middle Ages, you have certain people saying this is okay, certain people saying this isn't okay, and then it kind of becomes more consolidated in the later Middle Ages with the rise of the Inquisition and this kind of thing. But basically, it really would depend who you asked about whether something was magical or not. And to say that magic is just manipulating the cosmos, that could also apply to Orthodox prayer, exorcisms, which are kind of sanctioned by the Catholic Church. And so there's never really going to be one satisfactory explanation of magic. It really is going to depend on who you ask. And it's really going to depend on who's deciding, when they're deciding, the context in which they are deciding. And so really, I think we have a clearer idea of what might constitute magic today in terms of in a very different intellectual framework that we might have today. But really, it's very, very difficult to come up with a succinct definition of magic. But then there'd be no fun in that. So that's what makes it so excellent to study, but also kind of frustrating because there aren't neat ways of doing this. All we can do is say, there are certain things, of course, that are definitely magic, like demonic magic, or there's a book called the Liber Vaccae, which tells you how to kind of reanimate a cow and do all kinds of disgusting things, which I'm pretty sure definitely wouldn't have been okay.
Yeah.
There's no way of kind of neatly boxing this stuff off in a way that goes, this is occult magical practice, as opposed to, say, religion or natural philosophy. And then you've got things like astrology, which are kind of tightrope as well. So it's just constantly this kind of having to kind of put things into kind of quite a specific context, I suppose.
Especially, when you consider like the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri, where most of the, or not most, but some of the magicians in Alexandria in 100 of the Common Era were priests in Egypt. And then also, as to your point, Joe, is that, if you look at many of the grimoires from the Renaissance or the Middle Ages, they have all of the magical trappings of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, and this is what led scholars like Valerie Flint and later Keith Thomas to sort of think that maybe religion and the decline of magic, that, magic was somehow absorbed by the church, which I don't think is a kind of correct thesis, but I can see why you would be led that way, because there's almost a mimicking. I think the really thing that freaks authorities out about this stuff is the way that it does mimic, or seem to mimic, Orthodox Christianity and kind of pervert it. And that's kind of really not something that's kind of acceptable, and is actually quite, it's sacrilegious for that reason. If you look at ancient Rome, if you look at the Roman Republic, you've got diviners who are part of state equipment. You've got hierophysicians who, they examine the entrails of animals and have determined the future. You've got auspices, you've got augurs, people going looking at birds and kind of making predictions based on the flights and the noises of birds. And so it's only during the Roman Empire that this stuff begins to become problematic. We have to remember as well that, you can look at certain times and certain places and see magical activity being prosecuted. There are kinds of bubbles, I suppose. When you think about the witch trials of the real witch crazes in early modern Germany, in Trier and Bamberg and Würzburg, there's a kind of moment of prosecution and persecution, I suppose. And in that case of people who weren't even practicing magic, that was almost a kind of a hysterical moment. And so I suppose it's less about magic becoming more and more prosecuted, or less and less prosecuted, and more about looking at these bubbles, these moments in time.
I love that you quote Lewis Carroll in your article with Through the Looking Glass, which is, of course, the famous Humpty Dumpty saying, quote, "When I use a word," Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, "it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less." To that point, Joe, you tell your students medieval people didn't share a brain, that these things really did kind of percolate in different bubbles across the area.
Yeah. Words mean what you want them to mean, right? The meaning of words changes. And another thing that I'm very interested in is retrospective diagnosis of medical conditions. You know, why you get led down very false paths if you start looking for example, gonorrhea. Okay, I hate to go into something so grim first thing in the morning, but it's a good example. If you look at gonorrhea in the early modern period, this word just means discharge from the genitals. It doesn't mean what we know as a specific bacteria today. So if you start looking for some kind of history of gonorrhea by looking at this word in documents, you're not going to get very far, because gonorrhea is kind of a symptom. It can be caused by too much sex, not enough sex, or trauma to the area. And so the idea that celibacy could cause gonorrhea, you're kind of definitely barking up the wrong tree there. So I just think it's always worth thinking about what a word means in a specific context and why that word's being used. And definitely with magic, it's definitely still one of those words, I think, that somebody might look at an orthodox religious practice today and go, oh, that's magic. But the person who's doing it isn't going to think it's magic. They're going to think it's a pious way of expressing their religious beliefs. And so it's quite a scientific approach, isn't it, to kind of take things at face value, objective value. But all documents and all evidence is subjective. Even a list of things, a shopping list, is subjective, because there's so many things it doesn't tell you. It's not necessarily, you know, just because your shopping list says these are the things I'm going to buy, that doesn't mean you buy all of them. That doesn't mean that the person went and bought all of them and brought them all home. It doesn't mean there might be stuff they left off that they forgot to put on their shopping list and that they added when they got to the supermarket. So to say that, like, here's some of the shopping list, so here's what they bought, is even problematic, right? Another linked problem to that is that often one of the biggest skills of the historian is to understand documentary form and how documents are written, why they are phrased in certain ways, why they include certain information, and why they exclude certain things. A good example would be a letter or an email that we might send today. Address at the top, dear so-and-so, I hope this finds you well. Chunk of text, yours sincerely, name. And so that's quite a simple example. When you think about the Middle Ages and you think about the way that things are written, sometimes documents might be written in, say, hagiographical form. So you might have the biography of a person. You're trying to make a case for them to be a saint. And so the way that you write things and what you emphasize and what you include are going to be things like extreme suffering, talking to animals, these kind of tropes of saintly kind of, and there are certain ways in which you phrase things. If you look at papal letters, if you look at charters, there are ways that these things are phrased. You have bits of boilerplate text, you have a certain way of writing. And I think this is such a massively important skill in the historian's toolkit. And it takes time to learn this stuff. And this is why history isn't writing about the past. A part of it is, of course, writing about the past. But history is about critically analysing your sources and understanding why they were written that way, and understanding what biases they might have, and understanding all of these things and making connections and postulating links. And I think this is something that often gets lost. And people think that, you know, anyone can do history because it's just knowing about the past, right? That's not true. There's a massive skill to being a historian. That's another really important part of all of this.
In fact, Joe, why don't we kind of talk about even the word medieval itself? So many people love to throw that around like, oh, that's medieval thinking, or, oh, that's, you know, such a medieval way to look at things. Can you share with the listeners, Joe, a little bit about the genesis of the word and the usage of medieval versus, say, the Middle Ages?
Okay, so medieval, the term medieval was coined in the 19th century. We have the Victorianists and the kind of 19th century intellectuals to thank for a lot of this stuff. But basically, in the mid-14th century, there is a guy called Petrarch in Italy. And Petrarch is a survivor, in fact, of the Black Death of the mid-14th century. And it's Petrarch and his contemporary, and Petrarch coined this term Dark Ages, because you have to see him in the context of his own time and what he's living through and what he's seeing, which is they truly thought that, you know, the last 1100 years or so, since the fall of Rome, so the last 1,000 years or so had to happen was the recovery of classical learning. So the learning of, we're talking Aristotle, we're talking, you know, Hippocrates, we're talking all of these kinds of ancient and late antique authors. Maybe what they didn't realise so much was that these texts had actually been circulating in the Middle Ages, what we know as Middle Ages. And I think the Renaissance, which is kind of the kind of genesis of the Dark Ages, is a very kind of self-conscious, we are different people to the people who came before us. in, this dark age of a loss of learning, a loss of enlightenment, a loss of kind of the wisdom of the ancients. The coining of the term and how it came about and the sort of contrast between the Renaissance and the so-called Dark Ages is a very interesting moment in time in its own context, and in the context of Petrarch and in the context of his contemporaries. But it's only interesting really in that way. It's not a particularly accurate portrayal of what had happened in the past 1,000 years. Now, medieval, Middle Ages, these are terms that happen in the 19th century, and they essentially mean the same thing. Like medieval comes from medium aevum, so middle time, Middle Ages, and it basically means middle as in between the wonderful time of the Roman Empire and the Roman, and the wonderful Renaissance. And again, that's problematic, although it's interesting in the context of medievalism, as we call it, which is the way that the Middle Ages are used either in popular culture. Medievalism is a big deal in the 19th century. They're all trying to kind of build neo-Gothic. John Ryland's library, in fact, where I work, is a great example of late neo-Gothic architecture. It's kind of, let's make a building that looks what we think medieval is, right? So it's got spiral staircases and turrets and Gothic arches and stuff. And it's beautiful and it's wonderful and it's really interesting in its own time, but it's not exactly medieval. And so these terms are interesting in terms of when they were coined and why they were coined, but they're not interesting in terms of what they say about what we call the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. I mean, we don't really use the term Dark Ages because I'd only really use the term Dark Ages if I was talking about Petrarch and talking about his coining of the term. And medieval is equally problematic, but it's a convenient placeholder for the period of time that we are discussing. I think it's almost like we're reclaiming it as well on behalf of those people and kind of going, well, we're talking about 1,000 years of history, and we're also talking about massive difference between what happens with the fall of Rome in one place and with, the start of the so-called Renaissance and the early modern period at the other. And so you have a variety of people who think in a variety of different ways. The vast majority of people, we have no idea what they thought because they weren't literate. We have a lot of sources. I mean, mainly it's written sources, and those are going to be written by certain people who are, literate, probably, certainly for the earlier period, religious as in monastic. Later, we do have some stuff written by different varieties of people. But ultimately, the idea that all medieval people thought in this way or all medieval people thought in that way, I mean, that's as stupid as saying that you and I think the same way, or that Manchester, where I live, the entire population of Manchester thinks this way or thinks about this or thinks about that. And it's just tedious. People do it about the Victorians as well. Oh, the Victorians thought this. And it's like, well, if you just scrape the surface a bit here, you can kind of see that's not really the case. And I think there is something about letting the present off the hook by placing all this stuff in the past. That's really dangerous because, like I say, there are scary things happening at the moment, aren't there? So it's endlessly frustrating.
It just seems like even though we are so ready in the 21st century to kind of label the Dark Ages, quote unquote, the medieval period, quote unquote, the Middle Ages, as this kind of monolith, this kind of just like everything's the same, everyone thinks the same. It was teeming with these kind of heterodox views in terms of approaching these subjects.
I think you've got some really important thinkers at this time, really important theologians and intellectuals like Thomas Aquinas. So Gratian's Decretum, which is, it's a compilation of canon law produced in Bologna in the 12th century. And basically Gratian is grabbing all the sort of bits of canon law from different sources that he can find and putting them all together. And the idea is that, there are all these things that contradict each other, and I'm going to bring them all together and hopefully we can try and find some kind of solution to this, yeah? And so that's kind of an acknowledgement that, there are these differing opinions, and trying to kind of bring in this synthesis of kind of canon law is what Gratian's doing, and it's in no way a final word. And Thomas Aquinas later in the 13th century is kind of, when he writes his Summa Theologica, it's very scholastic, and it's like, you argue this point, there's one point you argue, there's one point you argue, and let's try and come to I'm going to kind of come to a kind of conclusion on this, but I'm certainly not leaving out, putting in this alternative view to this kind of topic. And the whole scholastic method that you get at the university is basically, try and win this argument. You come from this point, you come from this point, let's try and win an argument, You might even ask questions like, does God exist? These are questions that might have been asked during a scholastic debate at a medieval university. And so I think the idea that somehow things were kind of controlled and repressed. And I think another problem that we have is that we tend to assume that because the law in the Middle Ages said, for example, you must all do this, that everyone automatically did that. Firstly, laws tend to come in because people are doing the thing they're not supposed to be doing. but also the idea that, that we all obey the law now, and we're all very kind of, and so the idea that because, the law in the Middle Ages might say, you have to go to church this many times a year, that means that everybody just does that. The idea that you didn't have any dissent, and I think this is often perpetuated by the fact that we don't really, in the UK, I can't speak for the States or other places, but in the UK we don't really do much medieval history at school. Quite rightly, we do a lot of the Second World War, and I would never kind of deny that that's important. I think all periods of history are interesting and important. I do feel like there's this kind of bias towards more modern topics. So I think, there's a lot of kind of frustration, really, about the popular kind of imagination regarding the Middle Ages. But in terms of people like the irritating STEM bros, these people have no excuse, and they just need to sit down and do some history and philosophy of science, because there's no need for people like Steven Pinker to perpetuate myths. There's no excuse there.
Yes. We should probably define for the listeners the irritating STEM bro, which you trademarked, by the way, which is just fantastic in the article.
That was just a joke. I actually thought Andreas would edit that out and didn't, and I was quite delighted when he didn't. No, so basically there are people like, Richard Dawkins is another good example. Richard Dawkins, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Steven Pinker. There are a lot of, you often find it with scientists, but there are people who are sufficiently elevated, I suppose, they have got professorial chairs at Oxford or whatever, and they seem to think that because they have mastered science or mastered their own topic, that they are somehow qualified to talk about the history of their topic. They often tend to apply these kinds of methods of, you can't really apply this kind of same scientific method to studying the past. Like, for example, you can't see documents as objective, right? They're trying to write hagiographies of science, and I think you can completely be like, look how wonderful science is, without trashing the Middle Ages. I think it's perfectly possible to be like, isn't it amazing how much science has kind of revolutionized things like healthcare, without thinking that we still don't have all the answers, right? But it's always disappointing the way they feel the need to kind of dunk on the Middle Ages and dunk on religion, because the idea that somehow human beings are rational, or that we're more rational than we were, is really fatuous and actually quite dangerous to think that somehow people now are purely motivated by what they call reason. So that's the first thing. But also, so the irritating STEM bro is someone who kind of comes along, and because they speak with so much authority, and this is a really, really interesting thing, is that they would say that the Middle Ages had no logic because people all just listened to authority, right? It's all about authority in the Middle Ages, or a lot of it's about authority, where you're like, oh, Aristotle says this. That's a big deal, right? So that must be legit. And there are a lot of pseudonymous texts, so pseudo-Aristotelian, you put if you want to write something you want people to take it seriously, you don't put your name on it, you put Aristotle's name on it, or you put Hippocrates' name on it, or you put Bede's name on it, right? But precisely the same thing happens. If Neil deGrasse Tyson says, medieval people thought the earth was flat, which is another complete myth, people are like, oh, well, Neil deGrasse Tyson said that, so that must be true. And it's almost like they are probably unwittingly playing into that model of authority, which I find quite a delicious irony. And they have a big platform and they have a big responsibility. And it's just a shame, because a lot of the best historians and philosophers of science that I know actually trained in natural sciences originally and then moved over to HPS for their graduate degrees. And so a lot of the best people I know doing this topic have a kind of solid grounding in natural sciences or in, physics or something like that. It really does kind of irritate me, but also make me laugh to see that they're playing into this model of authority. People like Steven Pinker, in both of his books, actually, on violence and on the Enlightenment, cherry picks evidence to suit his agenda, which is exactly the kind of thing that they would accuse the medievals of doing, In fact, people like Thomas Aquinas and people like Albert the Great, they took in all the evidence they could find, and they kind of tried to synthesize it. And so I think there's just two bits of absolutely delicious irony there that I'll probably never stop being quite smug about. It's just disappointing. They could be saying science is brilliant, but not needing to dunk on the Middle Ages to do that.
You mentioned that in January 2016, Neil deGrasse Tyson tweeted that the idea of a round Earth was, quote, lost to the Dark Ages, and that the original idea came from ancient Greece, but the Dark Ages, extinguished any kind of inquiry there. But as you say in your article, quote, this is categorically untrue. But, you say, even if medieval thinkers had thought the Earth was flat, that would have been okay. The idea that we only value what people in the past, quote-unquote, got right is part of the same problem. And can you kind of elaborate on that, Joe? Because I think so many people are obsessed with, well, look at what they got wrong in the year, 1223,
Oh, I mean, it's just so tedious. Basically, the point that I'm trying to make is that there may have been some medieval people who did think the world was flat. There are some people now who think the Earth is flat. Right. And so firstly, medieval thinkers, the evidence that we have, conceived of a kind of spherical Earth because they used logic and they used observation, right? Because you can see that there's like a horizon and they are observing this stuff and kind of calculating, and they're using the stars to navigate. It's the kind of stuff that you would expect the likes of Tyson to approve of. But my point was that even if they come up with the idea that the world was flat, it's not really interesting to me, this kind of idea of progress or about, but look, they were right. That's not what's interesting to me as a historian. What's interesting to me is why it would be thinking, right, well, why did they think that? What was the logic? And that would have been interesting. It's like this whole thing that somehow we only look at kind of the past in terms of progress. And I suppose that was the point I was trying to make, was that it's all part of this same problem of wanting to see objective right and wrong. But the fact is that no, the evidence that we have from the Middle Ages, and there's even a Wikipedia page that's kind of broadly correct on this topic that Professor Tyson might have deigned to even take a glance at. This is not what the evidence that we have says. The evidence that we have from Middle Ages says that thinkers for which we have surviving evidence thought the Earth was spherical. It's not only untrue, it's again just an example of something that's just not particularly interesting. And so my refutation to that will always be, you're wrong in two ways here. You are wrong because that's not what they thought, but you're also wrong in that that's not interesting. And if they thought the Earth was flat, that'd be really interesting because we could then go and see why. Because there would be some logic there. There would be some reasoning on this. And again, the idea that the flat Earth is somehow not something that anyone believes in anymore is ridiculous, because all you have to do is go on the internet and look up, flat earthers, and they're everywhere.
You also touch in your article, Joe, on medieval medicine. I'd love to chat with you about that because, as you mentioned, people have these assumptions that you point out where, medieval medicine, it's just leeches and witchcraft, and that has nothing to do with either how medicine was investigated in, antiquity and kind of the quote-unquote classical ages, and it has nothing to do with, post-Middle Ages in the Renaissance. But you point out that, there was a lot going on with Middle Ages medicine. Can you share about that?
Well, there's a lot going on with medicine today, isn't there? We have orthodox medicine, but we also have a lot of people who practice what we call alternative medicine, right? And so again, the idea that somehow the Middle Ages had one particular brand of medicine, which was leeches. I'll come back to leeches in a bit because leeches are another bugbear of mine. And here's the delicious irony of medieval medicine is that medieval medicine, orthodox medieval medicine, is basically orthodox ancient medicine, right? And so the idea that somehow the great learning of classical antiquity was lost to the Middle Ages in terms of medicine is wrong, because it's a continuation. I'm going to preface this as well by saying that, medicine is one area in which we can see that, we've made a lot of progress over the last couple of centuries. I'm grateful for the medicine that I have, the medicine that people I love have been able to access. And so I'm not kind of trying to say that somehow that people didn't suffer. People did suffer. And stuff like toothache, mouth infections, killing people and stuff, that's, something I'm glad that I didn't have to deal with. Although with antibiotics on the way out, I'm not sure, how long that's going to last for. But anyway, medieval medicine is ancient medicine in the orthodox medieval medicine, but based on humoral theory, right? So you've got 4 humors in the body: blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. Everyone has their own individual balance of these things that keeps them well. And it's your doctor's job to figure out what your makeup is. And so that's why you have bleeding and purging, basically making someone vomit or have diarrhea to kind of like a laxative or an emetic. Bleeding and trying to draw pus out of wounds, and so using poultices to try and do that. That's the logic there. Okay. However, you've got all kinds of other stuff that goes on around that. You've got stuff that would have been broadly conceived of as kind of magical. Leeches, the whole point of leeches is the whole bloodletting thing, right? Because leeches suck blood. However, I've come across only one piece of evidence that I know of leeches actually being used at any point in the medieval period for bloodletting. Leeches are a big deal in antiquity and earlier, and after the Middle Ages. Leeches are a big deal in the early modern period. And I believe the peak use for leeches is later, even 18th, 19th century. And so, in fact, medieval is the last period that I'd associate with leeches. But for somehow it's just become this kind of byword for medieval medicine, right? The other problem is that the word leech, and again, this is a problem with words and what they mean, the word leech is sometimes used to mean doctor in medieval English. So a leech is a word for a certain kind of medical practitioner that we come across in documents. But we don't know any link between that and the use of a natural leech to let blood. I think it's a separate etymology. So firstly, leeches, no, not as far as we know, not a big deal. But the purpose of leeches is bloodletting, which is, if you look at the framework of humoral theory, there's a logic there. There's also sympathetic medicine. So there's an idea that like cures like, the doctrine of signatures. So if you have a plant that's shaped like a kidney, that will help you with kidney problems. If you have a mule's hoof, again, back to the mule, another one of my favourite topics, because mules are sterile. You would use a ground up mule's hoof to procure an abortion or as a contraceptive, because there's this idea that because mules are sterile, you'll kind of absorb some of that and it will kind of stop you from getting pregnant, or it will help you to procure an abortion. So that's another strand of medicine. You've also got astrology to kind of make predictions, I suppose, about the course of someone's illness. And astrology has this very complex and precise logic to it if you accept the basic premise. The words astronomy and astrology are interchangeable at this time. Nowadays, astronomy is a legitimate academic area of study, and astrology is seen as this, this kind of separate sort of pseudo-scientific thing, whereas in the Middle Ages, these two are quite interchangeable. But astrology is really interesting because it becomes, and this is again where I get interested about things that don't fit neatly in categories, it becomes a part of the medical curriculum at the university in the 14th century. But judicial astrology, so predicting the fate of an individual person, is really quite dodgy because you're messing with the idea of free will and divine providence and stuff. And so astrologers are kind of walking this tightrope of kind of leaving themselves open to accusations of certain things. And so astrology is another one that you find other methods of like divining, future, uroscopy is big. And so that kind of plays into the humoral thing. So examining someone's urine, the depiction of a physician in the Middle Ages, physicians are depicted in manuscripts and in art as holding glasses of urine up to the light to kind of see what they might see there. And all five senses are used to discern someone's urine. So sight, taste, smell, touch. So that's really quite disgusting. Doctors are actually tasting people's urine and they heat it up and they do all kinds of things. I know, yeah. And so my point is that while you have this orthodox framework that the educated physician who's gone to university will have been, that will be their kind of bread and butter, you also have, we look at manuscripts and we see all kind of stuff copied in together. And it seems that, practitioners were using all kinds of stuff. Monks, who were also often medical practitioners, are doing all kinds of things they shouldn't be doing. And Sophie Page's book, Magic in the Cloister, is a study of the monastic library at St Augustine's, Canterbury. And they had all kinds of magical books with like black magic, demonic magic, nothing remotely borderline, people are doing all kinds of things that they technically shouldn't be. The overwhelming number of people in the Middle Ages couldn't even afford to think about seeing one of these physicians, and they would have gone to their local wise woman who might have had more empirical based remedies like herbs that, they knew that peppermint, for example, they used peppermint for stomachache, which today we have peppermint tea for stomachache. So stuff that's been kind of tried and tested, I suppose. So there's a lot of stuff that is kind of, well, I've tried this and it worked, let's try that. And diet, regimen, what you eat is a big deal, how you sleep, all kinds of different stuff. The same way that, today you go to your doctor and you say, well, and they give you some medicine, but they might also say, well, have you been getting exercise and have you been doing hobbies and have you been, there's all this kind of lifestyle stuff that goes around good health, I suppose. And I think, the Black Death comes along and I think physicians are quite rightly, faith is lost in the orthodox medical system, as you might imagine, because people are just falling down dead everywhere. And it's an absolute tragedy, really, when you think about the devastation of the Black Death. And so it's certainly not this monolith. There's all kinds of stuff going on.
Absolutely. And to that point, Joe, can you share with the listeners some advice in terms of how can we avoid becoming irritating STEM bros ourselves? Is it just a matter of, as you mentioned, kind of really delving into the history and understanding that? Are there things that people can do right away to kind of make sure they don't fall into that trap?
Well, if you see someone tweet something like Neil deGrasse Tyson or Stephen Pink or whatever, like, why are they tweeting it? Like, don't take their word for it. Don't take anyone's word for it. Go and look stuff up, Forbidden Histories, where I did my blog post. I mean, it's a fantastic website. Loads of debunking myths on there precisely about how, Andreas's whole blog, whole thing with Forbidden Histories, which I love, is the fact that you can't take the pieces of Pierre and Marie Curie or of Newton or of Roger Bacon that you think fit your narrative about science. You have to look at them as whole people within their entire context. And so you know, the fact that Newton was into kind of all kinds of occult stuff and was deeply pious doesn't really fit that narrative, and so people tend to ignore it, and that's really not how you should deal with stuff. And so firstly, one of the great things about being alive today is that we have the internet, and there's lots of good stuff on the internet. But again, stuff like Wikipedia, don't take Wikipedia's word for it, go and see what it's citing, and then go and sort of speak to those people. And like, you know, there's people like me on Twitter, we're always prepared to talk about stuff 24/7. Ask an expert. We love it. We love talking about the stuff that we know about. There are a couple of books coming out soon. So a colleague and friend of mine called Winston Black, who is Winston E. Black on Twitter, is bringing out a book debunking some of the main myths about the Middle Ages. I think Flat Earth is in there. A good friend of mine, Seb Falk, is bringing out a book called The Light Ages next year, which is designed for the interested layperson, but it's a book written by an academic about some of the amazing natural philosophy and astronomy and stuff that took place in the 14th century. There are lots of books out there designed for the interested layperson that aren't, you know, kind of academic tomes with massive reams of footnotes. But yeah, ask an expert, like we're all over the internet. And just remember that, you know, it's always more complicated than that is one of my other kind of phrases, you know. It's never simple. It's never one thing or another. It's never, you know, in this neat box or in that neat box. There's lots of resources out there, but read widely if you can, I suppose.
What are 2 or 3 things that you think people should always remember and keep in mind about the Middle Ages, or just asked in the negative, what are things that you think people should never say or associate or, you know, assume about the Middle Ages?
Okay, so in terms of remembering about the Middle Ages, I think, you know, again, I'll come back to the drum that I bang about pluralities of thought. And so not everybody thought the same thing. There wasn't this shared brain that somehow split off on the 1st of January 1500. Related to that, medieval people aren't going, oh, well, we live in this Middle Ages, you know, we live in this time that's kind of, you know, there's going to be this massive progress ahead, because that's a very modern way of thinking about things, you know. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing would be the point I made about documents and the point that I made about who is writing documents, documentary form, and how you can't really understand documents until you know why they're written in a certain fashion. It's always more complicated than that. There's never a simple explanation. Like if someone says to you, well, what caused the Crusades, right? Why did people go on crusade, right? It's never going to be because they were religious, or because they were after money, or because they were racist, or because it's going to be a combination of things depending on which person it is. And you know, you can apply that to, you know, why did people think astrology worked? Well, it's not going to be, there were people who didn't think, who were skeptics. You know, you do have skeptics and so nothing's ever simple, I would say. And that applies to all historical inquiry for any period.
To that point, where can people check out your work and kind of related topics and chat with you? But then also, I'm fascinated, like, what are some of the things that you're currently thinking about in terms of future projects, future historical topics, areas of inquiry? Like, what are some of the things that you can share?
I don't actually have, and I need to sort this out actually, some space where I can put all my blog posts and stuff. The blog that's linked on my Twitter is mainly about mental health at the moment, but of course people are perfectly welcome to read that stuff. It's just not particularly relevant to this. I have 2 articles on the Welcome stories, and I have the article that I wrote for Forbidden Histories. I've just had another blog post come out for the Dictionary of Medieval Names from European Sources, which is pinned to my Twitter. And I've also got a book under contract, the book of my thesis, which is coming out in the future sometime. But I mean, I work full time in my job, so it's obviously quite a challenge to find the time to get this stuff done. But so my book will be the book of my PhD thesis, which was on numerology. In terms of future projects, I'm currently employed until December. So a future project would be like finding another job, which is kind of full-time job around a full-time job for most people in this gig. My next project is going to be on prognosis, medical prognosis in medieval and early modern Europe, late medieval and early modern Europe. So about the period of about 1200 to 1650, and looking at the multiple ways in which physicians or other kinds of people predicted life or death, or the course of illness. And so you've got the astrology, the numerology, you've got urine examination. I mean, that's kind of bringing in all of these threads about that I've talked about, you know, like the occult, magic, religion and science, I suppose, but also kind of the psychology around the prediction of death and deathbeds and kind of wanting to die in a certain good way so that you kind of give your soul the best chance of doing well in the afterlife. And so there's all kinds of things, and it's a really exciting project. That's the plan if I'm lucky enough to kind of get another job. Because that's a sad reality, is that, there's a lot of fixed term contracts, and I've been really lucky so far. But, that's a sad reality, is there are a lot of clever people out there wanting jobs, and it's really competitive. So yeah, that's the plan. I love writing, basically. It's a real pleasure to get stuff out there,
Dr. Joanne Edge, she is currently the Latin manuscripts cataloger at the John Rylands Library at the University of Manchester, and she wrote an excellent article we're going to make sure to link to, published on Forbidden Histories, entitled A Categorical Mistake, Science, Magic, and Religion in the Middle Ages. Joe, thank you so much just for taking the time and coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Listeners and Glitch Bottle patrons and supporters, I hope you enjoyed that chat with Dr. Joanne Edge as much as I did. I think that her reminder about how medieval people didn't share one brain and that orthodox medicine of the Middle Ages was basically the orthodox medicine of antiquity are refreshing, especially as I'm sure a lot of us are constantly poring over documents, articles, and commentaries that might throw around terms like medieval or dark ages casually. A huge thanks goes to Dr. Edge, and thanks as always goes to each and every amazing Glitch Bottle patron, supporter, and listener. Patrons can enjoy exclusive perks and bonus material and videos from our many guests and blog topics. And if you would like to jump on the Glitch Bottle caravan with us, visit patreon.com/glitchbottle to find out more. As always, you can subscribe to Glitch Bottle on YouTube and listen on Spotify, Spreaker.com, Stitcher Radio, and iTunes. And if you enjoy the show, leaving a review on iTunes is always most welcome. It is an absolute pleasure to chat with Glitch Bottle patrons and listeners, and reading your thoughts and engaging comments is wonderful. And as always, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.